This is a meeting of the Beverly Community Preservation Committee. My name is Wendy Pearl. I'm the chair of the committee, and we welcome you here tonight. We kind of have a special meeting members this evening to feature kind of learning more about the community housing option under the CPA. And we have Shelley Gehring from, oh, I should have got your, from MAHA, doing a presentation for us, which will be followed by discussion. And before we get started, I want people to know there's some media in the room. So, Amy, can you tell us who's here,
sure.
Please?
So in the corner over here, we have Luke Rivers. He's an Endicott student, and he's actually shadowing me as the environmental planner for the city of Beverly. He's doing a inside government project and taking photo documentation of what I do for my job. So he's here. He'll be taking some shots. You don't have to be in any of the pictures if you don't want to be. So it's just sort of trying to get some action and documentation of, CPC at least. So the second thing, we have BevCam tonight taping. It's not live, so they'll be taping our presentation, Shelley's presentation, and then the discussion afterwards. And then finally, if we're kind of discussing, people really need to speak into the microphones to be heard through the monitor over there. So, there's one at the podium or through here. So, I think.
So if the committee could introduce themselves, and then we'll move on to Shelley.
Marilyn McCrory from the Open Space Committee.
Wendy.
Amy Maxner, environmental planner for the city of Beverly.
Heather Richter, member at large.
Lincoln Williams, member at large.
John Thompson, planning board member.
We do expect another member to come a little bit late, Henry Pizzo from the Recreation group. So, and I represent the Historic District Commission on this committee. So Shelley, why don't you tell us who you are and what you're here to tell us about, and then you can do your presentation and then discussion will follow.
So do I need to be speaking into a microphone as well?
Well,
or just close to it?
Close to it, right? Okay.
If he can hear you, you're good.
So my name is Shelley, and I'm a program manager at MAHA, which is the Massachusetts Affordable Housing Alliance. And we are based in Boston and Dorchester, but a lot of our work goes statewide. MAHA focuses primarily on helping low and moderate people become first-time home buyers. So we do a lot of work educating people who want to become a homeowner. We have post-purchase classes as well. We do some foreclosure prevention work. We also do a lot of work with banks and with the state of Massachusetts to make sure that banks are investing in safe and affordable mortgages for more moderate income people. But my work more specifically is around CPA and helping to support communities in primarily the 495 belt, although I communicate with communities all across the state, helping communities that have passed CPA to use more of their funds for affordable housing, for community housing. So tonight I'm going to go through a presentation talking about the many different ways that CPA funds can help to further affordable housing goals in your community. And I'm going to talk through different examples of what other communities have done and some challenges as well. But we'd like this to be very conversational, so if there are any questions, anything that you're not quite understanding, then please feel free to interrupt and ask any questions or comment or whatever would make this a more beneficial time for you. So I first wanted to go back to kind of the basics with CPA and looking at the different funding categories. You see across the top there are the different things that CPA can fund, and then down the left there are the different words that we use to identify the types of projects. Housing is on the very far right, and you see the support category that's highlighted, and that you see is unique to housing, that housing is the only category that support goes towards, which is special. It provides some flexibility for housing funds, which we'll get into more detail later. And then the last row, the rehab and or restore, you see that CPA funds can go towards rehab with housing if the housing is acquired or created with CPA funds. And that's really important to remember as well. Just to go through some terms so that we're really clear, I know that the lighting is a little bit hard to see from here, but just so that we're really clear what these things mean pertaining to housing, to community housing. One, when we talk about acquire, the law actually says acquire is to obtain by gift, purchase, devise, grant, rental, rental purchase, lease, or otherwise. So that's acquire. Create doesn't actually have a formal definition, but it generally speaks to new development or reuse of existing buildings. Preserve, in the CPA law talks about that it's preserve is to be used for protecting real property from injury, harm, or destruction. So sometimes we want to use preserve for almost like rehab, but it's very specific that preserve is for protecting real property from injury, harm, or destruction. So that's some of how that's been used is, for example, some communities want to help with housing authority buildings, and because that wasn't created or acquired with CPA funds, then you can't use that under support category and the other categories. But with preserve, if there's such destruction to the building that units are no longer inhabitable, then some communities have been able to use this preserve to help with major things like roof repair on a housing authority building, even though it wasn't acquired or created with CPA funds, because if it's causing units to no longer be habitable. But some communities have used preserve really loosely, and that's really not allowed. It's very much about protecting real property from injury, harm, and destruction. Support category, this was a little bit better defined with the legislation that passed in 2012. And so it more clearly states that CPA funds can go to provide grants, loans, rental assistance, or other forms of assistance. But then it uses this phrase, for the purpose of making housing affordable. And this is important because sometimes people want to use support for things that are really qualify as rehab. So for example, some communities would like to help seniors stay in their homes, but they need to make the house accessible. But if the home is already affordable to a person who, even if they're income qualified, even if they are earning up to 100% of the area median income, so even if their income is okay for CPA, if the house is already affordable, then making it accessible is really rehab. It's not making the housing affordable because the housing already is affordable. So people want to try to use support in that way, but it specifically is about, the litmus test is it making housing affordable? Because the intent of CPA really is to create affordable housing, whether that's a new physical unit or whether that's making housing more affordable to people who are earning up to 100% of the area median income.
Can I ask you a question on that point? But wouldn't making a unit accessible create an affordable unit for a different type of person? Isn't it expanding the audience or the kind of population that's being served?
So if you're going to give enough money to the homeowner, so if the homeowner is income qualified, existing homeowner is income qualified, and if you're going to give enough money where it can buy an affordable deed restriction on the unit, so that when it's resold, it's sold to someone who's also income qualified, then that could be acceptable under CPA. But oftentimes, the money that would be given to make a unit accessible isn't enough to buy a deed restriction, which restricts the value of the house. And so in that case, that's where it would be considered rehab, which would not be allowed with CPA.
I see. Okay, thank you.
So it could be, if then it would be kind of like a buy down, but you'd have to make sure that the existing person living in the house is income qualified, and then it would need to be a big enough grant. That situation isn't, I don't know anyone that's doing that. It's usually when the house is being sold, and then they negotiate with the seller, and the difference is paid to create a deed restriction. It's a little bit trickier when someone's already living in the house, so you just want to make sure that you would do any program like that, have it go through your solicitor.
Thank you.
And then rehab and restore, if it's acquired or created with CPA, then it is allowed. And just to touch on affordability restrictions, so the CPA law does talk about affordability restrictions. Section 8, this is for real property interest, whatever the category. So it does say the real property interest acquired with CPA funds shall be bound by a permanent restriction when it's acquired. And just to reiterate, because some communities aren't totally clear, that nonprofits can enforce the restriction, manage the property. That's completely allowed with CPA. So these are the variety of different things that CPA can go towards with community housing. They're the things I'm going to go through, looking at planning, creating housing, reusing existing buildings, buy-downs, rental assistance, and housing coordinators. So under planning, we always try to suggest that if your community doesn't already have some sort of planning done around housing, things like needs analysis, looking at the data, that we would always suggest that there's some sort of up-to-date planning so that the community has some kind of common vision around housing and housing needs, that there's some sort of accountability and trust because there's some sort of roadmap, and you can establish the need in the community based on data instead of opinions of different people, and people have very strong opinions about housing and who needs it and what the issues are. Some communities really just want home ownership, but when you do the needs analysis, you find that it's rental housing that's really needed. So planning can establish some kind of data that then you can create a plan to move forward with.
And can
it's not just about
CPA
emotion.
funds be used to
And CPA
do that
funds
plan?
There are a variety of different planning tools, and CPA funds can, under support, can go towards some planning.
Who would typically devise one of these housing plans?
So in different communities, it may be different entities. You're in the area of MAPC, which is the Metropolitan Area Planning Commission, and they oftentimes will help and provide support for housing plans. Jenny Raitt is fantastic. Sometimes it's managed in-house, depending on the capacity, maybe through a community development department. But it just depends in different communities. But MAPC is a great place to start to have that conversation if you don't have an up-to-date plan, and they may provide
You don't have one?
some resources.
It's at least, plans at least 10 years, if not older.
Ooh, yeah, that's pretty old. A lot of things have changed since then. So there's a lot of different kinds. Housing needs assessment, so a housing needs assessment or analysis that may be less intense than a housing production plan, which is certified by the state. Municipal affordable housing trusts oftentimes have plans. Sometimes there's a city plan that has a housing section. CPCs sometimes do plans. But I bring up all these tools because sometimes communities have the plans and they're kind of in a vacuum. They're not working all together. They're not integrated and they're not supporting each other. And we would just really urge the CPC to, when you do fund things, that you would fund it with the intention that it be broadly supported and that it be integrated into other plans so that you're moving the community's housing plan forward instead of just something kind of in a vacuum outside of that. And one plan that I like to bring up because I participated in the process a little bit and I thought it was helpful, is that Medway, when they first created their trust, their CPC decided that they wanted the trust to have a little bit of a vision and a little bit of a plan moving forward before they just transferred CPA funds to the trust. And so the CPC gave a little bit of money to the trust. The trust hired a consulting team, and they had a broad community process to talk about housing needs in the community, what already existed, where were the gaps. And they came up with, for the trust, they came up with a plan, and you can, I have the URL at the top, you can actually Google Medway Affordable Housing Trust Plan and get the whole PDF. But they came up with some goals, so these are the 5 different key goals that they came up with for the trust, which you can read through. And then they created more specific initiatives of the things that then they wanted to do under those goals. So they wanted to build capacity, and for them that meant, because they're a town, they're small, they don't have a lot of town staff to support housing, they wanted to hire a housing coordinator that would provide some assistance for the different housing groups in town and also to help move the housing agenda forward. They wanted to work on identifying and acquiring land in the community, so they were looking at land that the town already owned, they were looking at other potential available land. They wanted to support developers, so if a developer was trying to get a project off the ground and needed some gap financing for affordable housing, they wanted to be able to do that. They wanted to better monitor existing affordable units and to have capacity to run their own lotteries when a new unit came online. And then also, and part of that is retaining existing units. They had an experience where they actually lost a deed restricted unit through a sale process, and they didn't want that to happen anymore. So the benefit with this is that sometimes money is transferred to a trust, for example, and the trust doesn't have any more vision than the CPC does in terms of how to use it. And so this was a process where there were community meetings. They actually rented like a 12 or 15 passenger van, and they invited some key stakeholders in the community to go visit housing developments in other communities so that people could see with their eyes what affordable housing looks like today, because there are a lot of stereotypes of what it looks like. They wanted to see the different styles, the different communities, and how they have addressed affordable housing. So they did a variety of different things through this process, and then they had this plan. So then the CPC did transfer money to the trust, but now there's this plan that the community can measure the trust on before more money is transferred. They can come back and say, this is what we were successful on, this is what we had a hard time on, and they can adjust things. So one of the key things that a lot of communities do is try to create new housing with CPA funds. And there are a lot of different models and ways. Some communities have a housing authority that has some capacity to build additional units, to manage additional units. So there are communities where perhaps a nonprofit developer, these were both developed by, Cutler Heights and Holliston was a partnership between a for-profit and a nonprofit. And Benfield Farms was a nonprofit, but it's partnering with the housing authority as well to get housing developed in communities. So that's an option in some communities. A lot of times communities use existing buildings and they redevelop them for housing. Not every reuse project is historic. So the one on the left, Ames Shovel Works in Easton, is very historic. The CPC actually put in $3 million to buy a historic restriction on the site, although there was no CPA housing dollars specifically in that project. It was done like a 40B, so a lot of those units actually are market rate, but there's about 20% that are affordable. The middle one was developed by a nonprofit organization, and that building is not historic. So it had been empty, it was a nursing home, and NOAA, a nonprofit organization, redeveloped it into family housing, and that's rental. And then on the far right, Andrew's organization reused the Rockport High School apartments, redeveloped it into 31 units of rental housing that's age restricted, right up the street. And does that have an historic restriction on it?
It doesn't actually. Somebody else did the original development. We purchased it when it was on a preservation side, so it doesn't have a tax credit restriction or not historic.
But not historic.
It's historic registered, I'm sorry.
It is on the register. Okay. And then there are a variety of different kinds of programs, some that are creating new units and some that are just making housing affordable right now for people. Buy downs and purchase and resell, these kinds of programs can be created, they can be set up in a variety of different ways. Buy downs oftentimes speaks to, for example, if a developer is developing maybe a cluster site of housing units, maybe 15 or 20 units, and maybe there's already inclusionary zoning in the community, so maybe there are a portion that will be affordable, but sometimes a community might use CPA funds or trust fund money to negotiate with the developer to buy down an additional unit or two. So to pay the difference between, it's easier with sales, but to pay the difference between market rate and affordable in exchange for an additional deed restriction, an affordable deed restriction on the unit. That might happen in a 40B development as well, where it would be negotiating with the developer, but putting in money to buy additional deed restrictions. Purchase and resell, there have been examples where there was, for example, one of the trusts on the Cape used funds that they'd received from the CPA, and they purchased foreclosed homes. So this was when, during the thick of the housing crisis, they would purchase a foreclosed home. The trust would purchase the foreclosed home. They would do any renovations necessary on it. They'd add an affordable deed restriction, and then they'd sell it through a lottery to an income qualified person. And then they'd work with the state so that it was a part of the subsidized housing inventory, the 10% that the state would like to see in every community. Down payment assistance programs, you may be a little bit familiar with those. CPA funds can go towards down payment assistance programs, and also rental assistance for people who are income qualified. One program that I just wanted to highlight is in Sudbury, their home preservation program. So the way that this is run through their trust, and the way that they run the program is that they look out on the market, they look at houses that are for sale, they identify one that's a more modest house. So Sudbury is a community that's had a lot of issues with tear downs, where the more modest houses, like the ranch houses, are torn down, and then really huge houses are built because of the location. So they will identify a house that's like a ranch, where it's a more modest house, and they want to try to keep some of the fabric of that part of the community. and they'll go to the owner, the seller, and they'll negotiate the sale price. And then they actually have people who are already qualified, they're on a waiting list for this program. So they get the sale price, they negotiate the sale price, and then the trust puts in the difference between an affordable rate that's actually sold to the buyer, the income qualified buyer, and the sale price. And in Sudbury, the subsidy, this might be a year or two out, but it was about $137,000 subsidy per unit in this program. And that usually sounds like a lot of money for people when I first bring it up, except then when I say that the average price per unit to build a new affordable unit in Massachusetts is in the $300,000 to $400,000 range, and in some cases almost creeping above that. So when you consider that to create a new unit, that it's more than double that, then this actually looks like a bargain. They don't have a lot of houses that go through this because they have to wait for them to come on the market, but they've saved some houses, more modest houses this way in Sudbury. And then rental assistance is something that more and more communities are looking at, partly because now it's clear that CPA funds can be used for this, but also because we have a rental crisis in a lot of our communities. And one program that I like to bring up is in Dukes County. It's the Dukes County Regional Housing Authority on Martha's Vineyard. And I like to bring it up partly because it's been around for over 10 years. David, who's the head of the Housing Authority, created it many years ago, but also because it's actually a little bit different model than what most rental assistance programs are. HUD's model is what we call tenant-based, and it's where the tenant receives a voucher and then goes to find a unit. So it's on the tenant's, it's the tenant's responsibility. I think a lot of it because of the housing market on the vineyard, the Housing Authority actually plays the role of finding landlords who will sign 12-month leases. Because of course, as you know, they have the problem of 9-month leases so that the landlords can then make a lot of money in the summer with the tourist market. So the Housing Authority helps recruit the owners. They inspect the homes to make sure that they're up to code. They screen tenants, and then they invoice the CPAs that contribute. And on the vineyard, all of the different communities contribute to this one program that's managed by the Housing Authority. So it's a regional rental assistance program. So there are clearly efficiencies in a program that's regional versus just community by community.
Excuse me. So something like that, an annual commitment for those rental funds, so you're setting aside that not only in this year, but for future years as well?
So they do it year to year.
Oh.
They go to the CPC each year.
So the landlords are basically guaranteed 1 year of rental assistance.
So they target year-round residents. So they're starting leases in the fall, not in the spring. They target people that are earning less than 80% of the area median income. People that folks have to pay no more or can only pay up to 30% of their income. The tenant needs to pay, though, 50% of their rent, and the assistance is generally for 3 years. And in this program, unlike some of the programs that I hear about, or the new programs that people want to create, this program is a little bit more intimate with the folks in the island. They want to be responsive to the individual issues in an individual family. So what David has found is that the average household uses assistance for 3 years, but that there are some groups of people that need assistance for a little longer. So they found that people with disabilities oftentimes need support for more than 3 years. They found that single parents oftentimes need support for more than 3 years because if the kids are young, they need the kids to get to a certain age before the parent perhaps can work full-time or more than full-time. And they've also found that seniors sometimes need support for a little bit more than 3 years. So they don't have a hard cutoff of when you need to get off their program, which I think is pretty unique.
So that does commit to future funding cycles, or do they set it all aside at the beginning?
It would just be that they maybe wouldn't be able to take on additional if people haven't come off of the program.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. But their issue on the island is actually that they don't have enough landlords that will sign year leases.
Right.
So they actually have, you'll see a waiting list because they don't have enough landlords. They actually have more money than they have housing, which is really unique too. Yeah. So the housing, yeah, go ahead.
Is it solely supported by CPC? No.
Yes.
Yes.
That's actually not true. With one of the communities, the trust put in a little bit of money too. And that money might have come from the CPA, or it might have come from a different source.
Okay.
But most of it is CPA funds.
And that's the Housing Authority?
The Housing Authority manages it.
Managing.
Yeah. So that, for them, the Housing Authority's role is to reach out to the owners. They have a housing assistance contract that they sign with the owners. They screen tenants, they inspect the units annually, and they charge the owners a small fee to help with the administrative cost of that. They invoice the towns monthly. So when they were setting up the program, David felt like that the communities would feel more inclined to participate in a regional program if there was, the money is requested every year, but then he invoices each month instead of getting a lump sum from the CPC. So it's a little bit more administratively, but he felt that that worked better for those communities. And then he reports and requests funds yearly. The tenants sign a lease with the landlord. They have to earn less than 80%. They have to pay at least 50% in rent, but no more than 30% of their income. And the property owners sign the year-long lease. They sign the housing assistance contract with the Housing Authority. They receive the subsidy from the Housing Authority. So the fund is directly to the owner, the landlord, not to the tenant, the subsidy. And then they allow for the annual inspection, and they pay an annual fee to the Housing Authority. And these are their numbers, some of their stats for fiscal year 2014. They had 66 rental assistance subsidies, 147 people on their waiting list. $543,000 in CPA appropriations, a tiny bit of that was a trust. The average monthly subsidy is about $500. And the income that they serve is 45% of the area median income, so it's quite low income. And then just an overview of some of the benefits of a program like this is that it can quickly increase affordable housing options in the community. It can help stabilize the local economy. The property owner, then they have a stable screen tenant, and there's this other entity, the Housing Authority, that's a part of that relationship, and then the tenant has additional option for much needed housing, and also potentially time to help increase the household income. So whether it's working on getting a higher paid job, whether it's finishing a degree, whether it's helping the kids to grow up a little bit, but it's giving tenants a little bit more option. But there's also something in Massachusetts called the Anti-Aid Amendment to the Constitution, which you may be familiar with, but it says that public funds cannot be given or loaned to individuals or organizations for their private purposes. There needs to be some sort of public benefit. And the way that those are generally created, the public benefit, is through restrictions, lease agreements, and recapture. The restriction is, for housing, it's the affordable deed restriction that we generally put on housing, new housing. A lease agreement is with the rental assistance program. So you have the landlord and the tenant sign the 12-month lease. And so it's saying that for those 12 months, this unit is going to be affordable for this family. So that is considered the public benefit. And the recapture is generally used for like down payment assistance programs, where you give someone $5,000, a $5,000 grant to help with their down payment. And you forgive 1,000 of that each year for 5 years if they stay in the house. If they sell before the 5 years are up, then there's some sort of formula to recapture some of that public fund to go back into the fund to be reused, because it's trying to encourage people to not to get into a house and then in a year to sell it and to move on and have this public money that's in it. So there's a recapture formula. So more and more communities, particularly smaller communities, perhaps not as much in cities, but some smaller communities are using CPA funds to help pay for a housing coordinator. So someone that can participate in things like advocacy, monitoring existing units, helping with different programs and staffing, perhaps the Affordable Housing Trust or the Affordable Housing Committee. Advocacy can be organizing stakeholders, being a part of, being a voice for affordable housing in the community, so attending different hearings, and other boards. They can help staff these different organizations. Monitoring, so some different communities have different ways to monitor their affordable housing. Sometimes the Housing Authority plays that role. Sometimes there's someone on town or city staff. Sometimes nonprofits may monitor their own units. But some communities have a gap in that area, and so they've used CPA funds to hire a housing consultant, a housing coordinator, or a consultant to do that for them. And then when we talk about community housing, creating additional housing, then we need to talk a little bit about fair housing, the Federal Fair Housing Act, as well as the Massachusetts Anti-Discrimination Law. Because so many different categories of people have faced discrimination in accessing safe and affordable housing, or just safe housing in this country, then there are different laws to help protect people that have faced discrimination. And discrimination up to this point has been looked at not just what we might think of as blatant discrimination. So it's not just, for example, I had a woman, a single mom, call into my office and tell the story that she is being evicted because her house, the house she lives in, is going to be sold, and they want it empty. And so she called to look at an apartment in Hyde Park. She showed up, and the person said, "Oh, you're black." And she just turned and walked away because she didn't want to get into it and deal with it, which is unfortunate because this happens all the time. But she assumed that she would be turned away because it was so blatantly that he was surprised. He couldn't tell that she was black over the phone. So sometimes the discrimination is really blatant like that, but a lot of times it's actually what we call disparate impact. And disparate impact means when communities do different things, create different policies or programs that make it difficult for protected categories of people, protected groups of people, to find housing in that community. So creating a disparate impact could be if a community decides to write into their zoning law that they prefer townhouses with stairs. Because if the new housing that's being created all has stairs, it could be creating a disparate impact for people with disabilities to access housing in that community. Disparate impact could also be if your community is 97.5% white and you decide to advertise your affordable housing units just with flyers at town hall or city hall, at the local library, in the local community center, where it would be very unlikely that people of color would come across and see that, then that would could potentially be creating a disparate impact for allowing people of color to have access to housing in the particular community. And another example, one more example, is if a community starts to have a pattern of only accepting development that have one-bedroom units, it could potentially be creating a disparate impact for families with children to find housing in that community. And families with children are a protected category in Massachusetts. Race is a protected category, both federally and in Massachusetts. And people with disabilities are a protected category in Massachusetts. So this is just to show that discrimination is not, up to this point in the state and in the nation, discrimination is not just blatant, it's also if we're creating a disparate impact for protected groups. Actually, no, I added something to my slide at work and I must have not uploaded another one, so I'm glad I thought of it. I had added a note about residential requirements. I had an organization call me recently because they're wanting to submit a proposal to a CPC asking for rent assistance, money for a rent assistance program. And they were considering, and they didn't know if it was legal or not under fair housing, they were considering requiring that people have lived in the community for 2 years before they can qualify for the program. And I didn't think that sounded okay, but I went back to the attorney at the State Department of Housing and Community Development to talk it through a little bit. She focuses on fair housing, and she said, absolutely not. She said, constitutionally, it's seen as unconstitutional to require a residency in order to access public resources, public services. It's also why the state does not allow a community to do 100% local preference when you build new housing. Because you're potentially excluding certain groups of people certain protected groups of people if you're expecting them to already live in the community to access that housing. Then I was asked to talk a little bit about housing trusts. So this is going to be pretty short. I did bring a book that MHP, the Mass Housing Partnership, has put together looking at trusts. You can also get it online as a really big PDF. So they go through a lot more detail. But with affordable housing trusts, they are municipal affordable housing trusts, which means that they are a municipal agency. They're bound by the same regulations and rules of every other municipal department. an entity. But some benefits are that a housing trust can move more nimbly in the real estate market than a CPC, particularly with granting dollars or actually purchasing property or buildings. Trust can be the kind of the designated fund for affordable housing in the community, so it can be used that way, where dollars for affordable housing go to the trust, and then the trust is the entity that distributes those funds. And the trustees that are part of the board can be an additional voice for affordable housing in the community. That can be a benefit, to have more people that are advocating for affordable housing. There are potential challenges. One is that in some areas, there's already a good infrastructure of perhaps nonprofit organizations that are already doing a lot of housing development and work around housing programs. And so there is the possibility in some areas that there could be some duplication with a trust, depending on what the purpose of the trust is for. So it can create another layer. It is another board to staff. So if you're a community where everyone is already doing 10 things, there may not be a capacity to staff another board. You want to make sure that when it's set up, that the trustees have expertise in housing. So I'm in many communities where the members on the trust board are people who are really supportive of affordable housing, but they have no idea how to create affordable housing. They have no idea what they're doing. They're just really great cheerleaders, but they have no real capacity. The flip side is that in a community like Medway, they've put a banker on their board. They've put a real estate realtor. They've put someone who lives in a deed-restricted house in the community, which seems like a no-brainer when we're talking about affordable housing, except that Medway is the only community that I've ever heard of that actually has someone who lives in an affordable unit involved in something around creating more affordable housing. So it seems simple, but it actually doesn't happen all the time. So different kinds of things that a municipal affordable housing trust can do is they can fund affordable housing development, rehab existing homes to convert to affordable housing, increase affordability in new developments, develop surplus municipal land or buildings, and preserve expiring use. So expiring use, if you're not familiar, is that some deed restrictions are only in place for 15 years or 30 years. And so sometimes a community may use trust money or CPA funds to help to extend the restrictions on those units to keep them affordable. But recently, because of a Department of Revenue opinion that was written for a particular community, I forget which one, there were some issues that came to light that it's kind of interesting. It was kind of under our radar, even though it's kind of right there. But in the law that governs municipal affordable housing trusts, it actually defines the role of the trust as to create and preserve affordable housing. There's no support element that's more flexible in the CPA. And so some programs may not actually comply with the existing law that governs trusts. Because generally to qualify as create or preserve, you generally have a deed restriction, and a lot of programs wouldn't buy an affordable deed restriction. And then in some communities, the bylaws that were created to manage the trust actually don't give the trust the ability to enter into grant agreements. Some may, but a lot of them don't. So MHP is leading the charge on kind of working through some of these issues, either legally or legislatively. But there are a couple suggestions for people who do have trusts, and if you wanted to consider a trust, of what to do to address some of these. One is the suggestion that the legislative body give the trust the ability to enter into grant agreements. Because the second suggestion is that the CPA, when the CPA designates funds for the trust, that it be done with a grant agreement that specifies that the funds are to be used for CPA eligible activities. So through some legal opinion, the feeling is that that alone then allows the trust to do all the things that CPA is allowed to do with housing dollars, with those two steps. And just kind of a few final notes is just to, again, reiterate the support category that's special for housing, that makes housing dollars a little bit more flexible. that CPA funds can go for households making up to 100% of the area median income. I just remind people of that because we oftentimes stick with the 80% because of the subsidized housing inventory and the state's expectations of the 10%. But in communities, particularly communities that are over their 10%, then sometimes that creates an opportunity to focus on the 80 to 100% where there may not be as many programs servicing that income of folks. Of course, there's severe need for people at 30% and 50%, but I just like to bring that up because it's CPA. And then the Sudbury model is another regional model. It's MAPC helped to create this, but Sudbury, it started out of Sudbury, and it's that there's a housing office that provides different services for a variety of communities. So different communities pay like a fee to Sudbury, the Sudbury office, and then Sudbury provides different monitoring and lottery services for a variety of communities. And this is a contract that it's about 5 or 6 communities that participate. And there's been a more recent partnership in the Reading area. I think it's 3 communities that participate with this, having this regional housing office. And I bring it up because a lot of times every single community ends up doing their own thing, but it can be really inefficient. And when we have really limited public dollars, sometimes finding a way to partner together with additional communities to have the same kind of services done can make a lot of sense. It doesn't have to be a separate office. It could be, there could be a variety of different models. But those are 2 that MAPC has helped to set up to help negotiate. And I just like to bring it up because it could be
But doesn't our CPA money have to go to Beverly residents only?
Well, no. Actually, CPA dollars in the CPA law, your CPA dollars could be spent anywhere in the state.
Oh.
It's just would Beverly give money to Salem or somewhere else? That's a bigger question. No, but it's actually with this particular model. The community has a contract with the housing office, and so then there's a set fee, and then that can be paid with CPA funds. I think some of the communities use other funds to pay that as well.
It's similar to a home consortium.
It's not technically a home consortium, but it's separate because it's different services. But I mean, the idea is that it's working regionally and it's pooling resources. So instead of having every community have their own person that's doing lotteries and monitoring units, they have one person that's providing that for all of the communities. So you just have less overhead, less staffing is with one full-time, or I think that maybe they have 2 full-time people that help with that. So it can just create some efficiencies. Are there other questions or any? Yes.
Scott, we're taping with BevCam, so we can't hear you unless you're at the mic. Thank you.
Sorry. Shelley, I'm Scott Hausman, the City Councilor here in Beverly. Do you have an opinion? If so, what is it about the appropriateness of CPA monies being used for essentially maintenance expenses, or I guess repair expenses, let's say, for a local housing authority?
I think you missed the beginning.
So,
there was actually a point on that.
Let me, I'm just going to go back to, okay. So there's a category called preserve that some communities try to really stretch and use for anything at a housing authority. But the preserve category actually says very specifically in the law that CPA funds can be used for preservation if it's to protect real property from injury, harm, or destruction. So some communities have given money to housing authorities for really, like I know one that did it for to expand the parking lot. That's not at all the intent of CPA, and that's not falling anything in these categories. So there have been some CPCs that have given money to a housing authority because there are units that are literally no longer habitable because the units are so damaged. And so in that case, they've used the preserve category to bring those units back online. So perhaps for, in one community, actually up here, it was for...
Well, so I was just going to ask you, so if a housing authority said, listen, we have units that really need to be re-roofed, would that be considered an appropriate
So again,
expense?
I don't want to say specific, I haven't seen it, I don't know exactly, but
Yeah.
the litmus test is it protecting units from injury, harm, or destruction? So it can't just be rehab, but if it's protecting units from injury, harm, or destruction, then that's how some communities have helped with things like roof.
So if I hear you, there's sort of a spectrum here. You have to make sure you're not too far along the spectrum. You have to be close enough to one of these terms, and doing repairs that might be considered closer to maintenance as opposed to repair or protecting from harm. Sort of a judgment call?
You need to be careful. Some things you may even want to run through your solicitor, but the intent of CPA is to create and protect affordable housing. It's not for renovation. Unless the unit was bought or created with CPA funds, that's an exception.
So not to beat a dead horse here, but so maintenance would not apply?
Maintenance generally does not apply.
Okay. All right, thank you.
It would not be operating budgets.
Sure, thank you. Oh, and actually, while I'm here, one of the slides talked about CPA monies being used to hire, if I followed it correctly, hire staff to help deal with monitoring or enforcing affordable housing units and covenants and so forth, programs?
Some communities have used it to pay either a consultant or a housing coordinator to do monitoring or to run programs. Some communities choose consultants. There are a variety of different programs that are run by consultants. And then there are more and more communities, particularly towns, that have very little capacity. It's not so much in cities, actually, because cities usually have more capacity. In towns that are very small and they don't have anyone, like sometimes they don't even have a planner or they don't have a community development person. So sometimes a town, we see it more and more with towns where they will use some CPA funds to hire a part-time, usually it's a part-time housing coordinator. Some communities are trying to talk through how to share a person, but that hasn't happened yet.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Wendy, I see the clock is getting close to 8. I know some of our participants might have to go. I wonder if we could give them, and I'd like to hear from the nonprofit developers who are present here, what they think Beverly could do more of before we run out of time.
Yeah, could everybody introduce themselves? And I'd love for this to be more of a discussion about kind of where the focus of the community housing aspect of CPA should be going, because we don't really know. I think he means you, John.
He was serious.
Yeah, I know, right? He was serious.
Would you like to go to the microphone?
Don Preston, Beverly, Mass. I'm with Habitat for Humanity, North Shore. I think since we don't have a housing trust, one of the problems we see here is the ability to move on a property in this real estate market. Almost precludes us from doing a project through the CPA unless we already have it. And since the city doesn't have a lot of home funds to help in that acquisition, that makes it a little difficult. So I think that maybe looking towards an affordable housing trust fund, using inclusionary zoning funds and maybe some funding from here would help in that process so that when a property does come on the market, there's the ability to move on it within 60 days.
That's interesting. Could I just ask Aaron, since you're here, we do have one development that's going to generate a fee. I forget if it's the first one or not, but how would those monies be used in the absence of an affordable housing trust?
Well, my understanding, it could either go into a trust, we have to create one, or it could go into the portion of the CPC manages the housing section of the funds that you generate every year. My understanding is it can go into either.
Oh, okay, I didn't know.
We could, you know, so it gets to the point that was made about another board. One of the issues that we look at is the number of boards and commissions that we staff, bringing on another trust. From my perspective, kind of the challenges to Don's point, there's a lot of value in having a trust and being able to move it. I agree completely with that comment. it's been difficult for us to attribute home funds, whatever home funds that we have. We don't have a lot of money to actually allocate right now, but we will under this fee over $200,000. So having it in a trust where we can move quickly would have a lot of value. But then on the flip side, we already have a CPC that we manage, we assist and administer. So there's some efficiencies there. So I think in my mind, there's that kind of trade-off. That we also are, I think, lucky that we have a lot of capacity in terms of nonprofit developers in our region. We have 3 of them right here that are very capable. So we don't necessarily need a trust to create projects per se. I think the trust really would be a matter of moving funds to a program or a nonprofit developer in our community so that they can be more proactive.
Aaron, have we ever had a housing coordinator?
We do have a housing coordinator, yeah. Margaret right here does a lot of our housing programs.
Within a bigger office though, right? So is that your sole function, or do you want to introduce yourself? You are the housing.
And I'm from community development office, housing coordinator. Basically, housing rehab programs with CDBG funds, home, mass housing, get those type of programs. For first-time home buyers with home, things like that, monitoring, long-term monitoring. Lately, I've been doing some of the other monitoring for living units, local action units.
So the programming that's run through the city has significantly decreased in the recent years. We haven't received CDBG funds, Community Development Block Grant funds for housing programming since 2005. Does that sound right, Margaret? And home funds, which we receive through the North Shore Consortium, which is a home consortium, we do receive an annual allocation. About 4 years ago, the home program was slashed nationally, I think in something like in half. So right now we get about $70,000 a year to apply to affordable housing projects. So in the last 10 years, our housing programming has dwindled. And so I think...
Did you say 7 or 70?
No,
A
7.
year.
70,000.
70,000
yes,
a year.
yes. So our programming around affordable housing has really kind of dwindled down. A lot of the work that Margaret does is managing past housing rehab and first-time home buyer projects. So it's a lot of monitoring over the years, and a lot of catch-up. In fact, as was pointed out, a lot of communities don't do the monitoring that they're supposed to, and we're really ramping up our efforts on that front just to make sure that what we understand our affordable units actually are being allocated to residents who are eligible for them.
So, yeah, welcome.
Hi, so I'm Mickey Northcutt with North Shore CDC, and we're based in Salem, but have developed a lot of housing in Beverly also. We own 117 units of affordable housing in Beverly, 108 of which have been, or actually all of which have been created since about 2004, so in the last 10 years. So the way that we've created those housing units has been using the home funds that folks were just talking about as a small portion, like seed funding, to go get private loans and state and federal grants and investments to create, sort of mid-sized affordable housing developments. So, so we've used CPA not in Beverly because CPA wasn't in place in Beverly when the last project that we did here was being financed. But we have used CPA in Salem. We have a project that is kind of in the planning stages where we already have a CPA commitment that we used to actually acquire the property. It worked out in our case that the timeline was okay, waiting for the CPA committee to allocate it and the council to approve it. And we have another application in the Salem round for a different project currently, right now. I think the idea of having a trust would be, I echo what Don said, I think it'd be really helpful because it would allow us, if I'm assuming your rounds are in the sort of spring, summer, like Salem's are, if one of us had a project come up in the fall, it would be really challenging to have to wait until we wouldn't actually be able to do it. We would have to find a way to buy it and then bring that money in later. And just a suggestion I have that you might want to think about, I don't know if there's any reason that you would be precluded from doing this, but I don't see any reason why the CPC couldn't also be the Affordable Housing Trust. So that if you agree to be on the CPC, you're also agreeing to be on the Affordable Housing Trust and have meetings on the same night where you just open and close one and open and close the next. And if there's no agenda for the trust, then it's a 10-minute meeting so that you don't have to have another staff person. And I think like in Salem's case, I'm actually on the CPC in Salem. That hasn't come up yet because we've had projects in the rounds applying for money. So we haven't been in the situation that it seems like you're in where you're want to dedicate affordable housing money but don't necessarily have a project before you. So I think I would push for that in Salem or here to make it just administratively easy. And then I would just encourage you guys strongly to try to steer money towards creating permanent affordable housing units. And I just would really strongly advocate against using even $1 for rental assistance. It's not that that's not an important goal. It's just that there are other funds out there for that at the state and federal level. In some instances, private funding for that. And there are so few state resources and federal resources to create permanent housing that CPA is really like one of the last sort of vestiges of local funding. Like we heard that Beverly hasn't had CDBG in 10 years. Salem does get CDBG, but it's been cut in half over the past 10 years. Home was cut in half. That same trend is happening at the state level. So when we go into the state and apply for money, they're always constrained. Sometimes it takes us years to get funding. When we have a project that is like shovel ready, we have to go through many, many, many months and years of application. So the idea of using some money that is kind of, I think was originally intended to actually create and build housing for things that are not creating housing is a little frustrating from developers' perspective. Obviously you don't have to take that advice, but that's, I think one of the things I worry about is if communities start putting money into rental housing, because there's no projects before them, when projects come in, which they will in Beverly, you have 3 developers, if not others, that will come in, then it's hard to start telling the folks that you've been giving rental housing assistance to no in a year. So we've seen that, and communities can also use home dollars for that, and we've seen that in communities where if they start using their home dollars for rental assistance, when someone like us comes in and wants to create like a 30-unit affordable housing project, they say, well, God, we'd love to support that, but we don't want to take the money out of the pocket of this agency that's doing rental assistance. So it just stifles that source totally for us. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd love to know how you guys have worked within the context of a plan as well. If anyone, should we do a plan, a housing plan of some sort? That's kind of a question on my mind, at least. I don't know.
I don't think they're a bad thing, but I also think in Beverly you do have, one of the reasons communities do those is to encourage development, where there's a real void of that. Like I know Peabody did one about 2 years ago, for example, because they haven't had any real affordable housing development there. You have 3 active developers here who I think are going to bring stuff forward, and I don't think they're a bad thing. They would be helpful, but I don't think you have a huge problem here for lack of folks who have the kind of capacity to do this work. I think if you did do it, working with the development community that you have would be really helpful. But I think you guys are also already ahead of the curve. You have inclusionary zoning, you have a CPA, you're talking about an affordable housing trust, you're using most of the tools that are out there. So a lot of communities that do an affordable housing plan will identify things like you're already doing as goals that would be able to be implemented. So
I'll add to that a little bit. I agree with Mickey that we do have a lot of capacity in terms of development and developers in Beverly and have been very active. I think it's for me as a planner going to other communities, whether it's regionally, we have a much higher number of units than a lot that have been restricted. We're over 12%, which is pretty good. But that, from my perspective, shouldn't be the goal. Our goal should be actually higher than that. As a community, we should be shooting for more the state requires. So aside from the fact that we have capacity and we're in the head of curve in some areas, it has been 10 years since we've done a housing plan or a production plan. I do think it would make sense for us to go through that process. I think it would help build and strengthen the capacity we have internally within the city. And it could help with the board, the CPC, or a trust, but I do like the model that Mickey talked about, combining those two, but I think it would help with the CPC and kind of providing a direction and kind of creating a menu of options and strategies to build upon. And I think for the third reason is building a constituency around affordable housing in the city. Again, I think there's a strong one. There's definitely a group that really is interested in the concept, but I think we're hitting a place where it needs another shot in the arm. I think we need to kind of remind people that there's still a great need. And so I think there's a benefit to writing a plan just for the fact of promoting the concept, along with the idea of identifying specific tasks and action items.
Thank you.
I'd be very supportive of a plan.
Says the planner.
I think Aaron's saying he wants to do a plan. I'm Andrew DeFranza from Harbor Light Community Partners. So two things sort of to lead. One is congratulations. This is a great sort of problem to have. Beverly has a CPA. I can remember when Don Preston led an effort in, 2001, Don? We didn't know what we were doing. CPA was brand new, and we just ran around with signs and plotted in the back of the old Beverly National Bank building. I had a white Toyota Tercel, which was very tiny, and I had CPA signs all over it, parked on Cabot Street in front of First Baptist, because I thought that would be an effective and cheap way to market, and we lost. We lost that. But it was a good time, as everything with Don Preston was back in those days. So congratulations, you did it. So that's wonderful. And also a big thank you. You all are helping us with Harbor Light House right up the street, which was a recent grant that was successful through the State Supportive Housing Round. So thank you very much. So a couple of things about the CPA. We've used it 3 times in projects, twice in Rockport, one which Shelley mentioned, once in Hamilton. Harbor Light House will be the 4th. And we're pursuing a project in Wenham where we're also looking for CPA funds there. So we have a little experience in a handful of different communities over the last few years. Those other communities I mentioned, the 2 Rockport projects in Hamilton and Wenham, actually, they all require town meeting vote, which is an interesting and very enjoyable wrinkle to the process, as you might imagine. So this is better than that. And it's easier, simpler. So one technical item and then a little bit of advocacy that I think might be useful, and will echo a lot of what Mickey said. The best value, I think, from the development standpoint in our mind is the ability for local funding to create improved timing and improved leverage. Almost all of the stuff that we're going to do involves a situation where the affordable housing developers have a disadvantage on timing, meaning we have something we want to acquire and we don't have capital to do it, and we need to move quickly, and especially when the market gets hot again, which it is going to. It's very difficult for us to compete, and we get beat repeatedly on site control, and that is the dominant issue. So the ability of the CPA fund in some structure to help us respond locally with some speed is amazingly valuable, much more valuable than the size of the dollars. The other area is in terms of leverage, which we talked a little bit about with Harbor Light House. I know at least Amy and I and Wendy, which is most of the deals we're going to do are going to get funded by the state. That's mostly what's going to happen. And our ability to leverage small money locally as a fulcrum to create large money to create more units because of the state investment is dominant. And so anything we can do locally to help leverage the state into a deal. One of the ways we can compel the state as a city is to say, well, the city's already in the deal for X. And that gets the state's attention and helps us as Mickey mentioned, move through this very difficult process we have to at the state level. It's a little bit different on an infill project, which can move quicker, something like Don might work on with Habitat. There's some advantages to that they have better speed capacity than some of the bigger rental deals. So that's not true always, but those two are very big issues and major assets to having locally controlled capital: pace, speed, and leverage. On the advocacy side, I want to echo what Mickey said, that the main function in our minds, I think, as affordable housing advocates for CPA is to end up either A, with more units of housing, or B, avoiding the loss of units of housing. So no net loss and net gain. Those are sort of the dominant concerns. We work in a variety of the other suburbs in the area, and often what we see, and this is not to tell tales, especially because Matthew is filming this over here, which thank you, Matt, that's great, is that in some of the other communities, what they're doing is they're treating the affordable housing percentage, and Shelley is a nicer person than me, so she's not going to say this, but they're treating the affordable housing percentage as a tax on the overall CPA use. So they know they have to allocate 10%. The irony is they don't actually have to make any housing with it. So they have to allocate it, the 10%, and so they'll put it in an account and allocate it for the future, or they'll use it for something that actually doesn't make housing. And sometimes they'll use it to make a housing production plan. I tend to think in Aaron's case, in our situation, we really need it, so it's not a problem. But there are some communities, they spend the money, and they do for two reasons. They spend the money on the housing production plan, one, because it will help them avoid 40B for a period of time. So they use the HPP because DHCD approves it, and then they're exempt for a period of time from the housing production plan, which of course in the end never turns into housing. They don't ever actually do it. They just make the plan. And it serves two purposes. One is they avoid 40B for a period of time, and two is they use up their 10% allocation of CPA money on the plan that doesn't turn into housing eventually. So I know that sounds nefarious, but it's true. That's what and it's intentional. So they intentionally avoid the use of the housing money because they want the open space or recreation or the historic pres. Now the CPA money to them is net new, all of it's new. So if you get 90% of it to do with what you want, you're 90% up. And if you can find a way to not get in trouble on the 10% by creating staffing, plans, running studies, et cetera, or just allocating in an account that never gets spent, like Boxford. You can put that on tape, Boxford. That's what they'll do. And so that's what happens. So in terms of, I think Mickey's analysis was a good one, which is the more dollars can get used for actual creation or the avoidance of loss. That's a great barometer, and I think we would probably all agree with that. In Beverly's case, we have a good advocacy community, and if we needed to do a plan, it's got use. We're going to use it. That's a good thing. But generally, we want more units, and we want to avoid the loss. Those are the two things. You can edit that if you need to, Matt. Thanks.
Andrew, would you see a place for a trust in that, kind of being more kind of agile and
I think I've used, so in Rockport's case, we interacted with their trust on the first CPA deal. In Wenham's case, I'm interacting with a trust and a CPA, and in Hamilton's case, they now also have a trust. I think if we could make it a subset or a dual function, to Mickey's point and to Aaron's, I think that's got a lot to be said for it. As long as you have the functionality to have speed, then you don't really need another box to have to navigate. Sometimes that even gets messy because sometimes the CPC and the Housing Trust end up with diverse political agendas. And for people like us who are navigating risk, you end up thinking, oh my gosh, these 3 people are going to vote yes and these 6 people are going to vote no, and it can be a mess. It also can be useful depending on the situation. But so I would say, no, you don't need a trust to create the functionality. But the functionality would be good. I'm going to go pick on my kids now. Have a good night.
Thank you so much.
I would never talk to a community the way that Andrew just talked to you.
No, that's why I did it. Yeah. And Beverly is the greatest city in the Commonwealth. You can put that on tape too. And we're going to handle our business because we always do. So, anything else anybody needs? No.
Thank you.
I'm going to go pick up my Andrew.
I just wanted to follow up just a little bit that partly why we talk about a needs analysis, not to create another plan that sits on a shelf that's unhelpful. But the point of doing planning is so that you know where to invest. And it doesn't make any sense for a CPC to invest in restricted senior, home ownership if the demand in the community is rental family housing. So that's the point of planning, is that you get an idea where the needs are. And so some communities may find, I understand developers will always be uncomfortable with rent assistance. Some communities will find when they do a needs analysis that rental demand is so high and it's so limited that it makes sense to do in the short term to do some support for rental housing. It should never be seen as the housing policy or the housing plan. It should just be a piece of that if it happens at all in any community. I just wanted to say that in defense of And up here, I do have just a one page on fair housing, and just because some communities, some people are less familiar with that. And then there's flyers for the presentation if anyone wanted to pick those up.
Thank you. Shelley, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I feel like I know so much more about the housing component of CPA now, and I mean, we helped advocate to pass CPA, and I don't think I knew as much about housing then as I do now, so thank you very much. Is there any more discussion on this? I think there's a lot to think about, and it sounds like we may need to coordinate with the planning office a little more about where CPA funds can go first, and then where they go in the future, so.
Wendy, I did have a question
Marilyn.
for Shelley. Shelley, I was interested in your discussion of preserve, just defining it as protecting real property from injury, harm, or destruction, and you emphasized that units would not be habitable. Is that sort of like a threshold that the unit would not be habitable without?
So that's how one community one CPC has decided that they would be comfortable. There's nothing that's, some of it is that you need to figure that out as CPC, what you're comfortable with. But there's also DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, did put together a memo on this, and I can make sure that it gets forwarded to you, a little bit of guidance about CPA funds and housing authorities. So I'll just make sure that I forward that so that you have a little bit of guidance from the state.
That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any more discussion?
One more question for Erin. Does our housing plan identify our needs or our needs as of 10 years ago?
Yeah, it would. It was a housing production plan, but it's 10 years old. So much has changed now. There's been many projects that have been completed by the group that has been in here, the organizations, and the market's completely different. So it's, I understand and agree to what Mickey and Andrew are saying about plans for the sake of making plans, but I do think there is value for our city to kind of refresh what direction where we should go, and I think it would really help make sure that how the funds through the CPC and through our inclusionary housing, because we are going to be finding funds streaming through that way, are used in the best way possible. A housing plan is not terribly expensive to write. We would advocate for a consultant to do it, but MAPC could do it for very short dollars, so that you're not diverting money that could go to an actual project, because that is something that I would want to be mindful of, but I think it would be a valuable use of the funds.
I would point out another reason for it is that there are a lot of big projects in Beverly, and any one of those that went through an expiring use could tip us back under the 10% potentially.
This is absolutely correct. There's 4 or 5 very large projects that will be expiring within the next 3 to 4 years, and that if even half of those expire, we'll be under that 10% threshold. So we are in good shape now, and we have a lot to brag about in terms of providing affordable housing, but that can change very quickly. And so that was the second point that Andrew made. So first is creating new projects, the second one is preserving. And so that's another area where the production plan could protect us through 40B, because we don't want to provide, personally, don't see 40B as a great way to develop affordable housing units. There's better ways of doing it. So it would protect us in that way, but also help us understand and identify pathways to preserving those units, as well as creating some others. So.
Any other questions? Thank you all for coming. This has been very helpful. I think this is the beginning of a conversation that we can keep going until we figure this out for ourselves. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you.
Great.
I'll give that to you for the planning office.
Yeah.